But let's take a look at 3 different possible results of natural selection. The one that we've been talking about so far is actually referred to as directional selection. In directional selection, we are pushing the average appearance or the average traits of a population in one particular direction. We're shifting the phenotypic curve to some extreme. Say organisms are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, or their color is changing. They're getting more and more green over time. We're pushing them to the green end of the spectrum. We're pushing them to the large side of the phenotypic curve there. So let's imagine that there's a population of groundhogs. So it's a population of groundhogs, and groundhogs, they can be large or they can be small. And maybe the big ones, they have something of an advantage because the big ones are something that the predators, the foxes in this area, don't want to deal with too much. So when a fox sees a huge groundhog, something the size of a bulldog, it's not going to mess with that. It's going to look somewhere else for lunch. So the larger a groundhog is, the more successful it's going to be. The longer it's going to live, and therefore the more offspring it's going to be able to have and take care of, and it will pass more of its genes on. So directional selection would then cause the population to get larger and larger and larger over time as all of these smaller groundhogs get eaten by foxes. However, there are other possibilities as well. So there's something called disruptive selection. In disruptive selection, you might have 2 different phenotypes which are both very well adapted to conditions. They're both good strategies for surviving in a particular environment. So going back to our groundhogs, maybe that's true that big groundhogs have a survival advantage, that they're not getting messed with by predators. But maybe the really, really small groundhogs, the teeny tiny ones, the ones that are basically guinea pigs in size, well, they don't need as much food to survive, do they? They can get by with fewer resources. And they're going to be really good at hiding. They're going to fit into tiny little hiding place that the large groundhogs never would. So maybe they can avoid predators very, very easily, whereas groundhogs that are kind of intermediate in size don't get so many hiding places. They have the worst of both worlds. They're not big enough to scare away foxes, and they're not small enough to hide from the foxes. So in that case, the average phenotype, the medium-sized groundhogs, the ones in the middle, what we would call the intermediate phenotype, are going to be selected against. Those are going to be the ones that get eaten by all the foxes. And all the small ones, they're going to survive, and all the really, really big ones, they're going to survive. So any genes which are kind of intermediate, they're going to start disappearing from the population, and we'll only have big genes and small genes. So this leads to a balance between 2 or more contrasting phenotypes, 2 different formats. Now, something interesting can happen with disruptive selection. Let's take our example of the groundhogs. The big ones don't have to worry about predators, so they're probably going to be out in the field, eating grass, enjoying life out in the sun. They're not worried about that. They're out in the prairie, out in the open. But the little ones, they still have to worry about the foxes, so they spend all their time on the forest edge, hiding under bushes, and they only interact with other small groundhogs. So now we have 2 breeding populations. They're reproductively isolated from each other. All the big groundhogs are interacting with each other out in the field. All the little groundhogs are interacting with each other at the forest edge. This can create 2 different breeding populations. Since random mutations are going to occur in both breeding populations randomly, as time goes forward, they're going to become more and more genetically different from each other. Ultimately, this could lead to 2 different species emerging from this single starting population. One species of large groundhogs and one species of small groundhogs. Now going into that idea, we're starting to bridge on what is called macroevolution, the development of multiple species. And in order to have that discussion, we're going to have a talk about what the word species actually means, and we're not quite there yet. But this is disruptive selection. Disruptive selection means that extreme phenotypes, 2 or more contrasting extreme phenotypes, are being selected for. Those are the successful ones. And the intermediate phenotypes are being selected against. On the other hand, there's also something called stabilizing selection. Maybe being a big groundhog is not an advantage. Maybe that just makes you a target for very, very large predators, right? So wolves are now coming in, not foxes. If wolves are going to come in and they're going to aim for all these giant groundhogs. Then all the rest of the groundhogs, they have to compete for resources, and maybe all the little ones, they can't compete very well. So this selects for the intermediate phenotype. In that case, it would be the average-sized groundhog. They'll be the one that is the most advantageous. So stabilizing selection selects against extreme phenotypes and for intermediate phenotypes, the kind of average middle ground, the Goldilocks zone. That's stabilizing selection. Through stabilizing selection, you can prevent new mutations which create extreme phenotypes from taking hold in a population. It actually causes the population to approximately remain the same generation to generation to generation. If they're already supremely well adapted to their environment, there's no reason for natural selection to alter what that population looks like. So stabilizing selection will cause them to remain more or less the same in appearance. There will still be little mutations and changes that pop up here and there, but stabilizing selection will keep their traits approximately in the center. So let's look at a practical example of this idea. We have a population of mice, and these mice have a whole bunch of different coat colors, right? We have the basically white lab mice, the kind of Sprague-Dawley breed of lab mice with the pure white coat, and then we have the very, very dark colored mice, the black-furred mice. Then we have every shade of fur in between those two extremes. So the very, very dark colored mice and the very, very light colored mice, those are our extreme phenotypes. They're relatively rare in the population. They're at the wide ends of this population curve. Most of the mice are somewhere in the middle. The biggest amount of population is in the center of this curve. That's why this bell-shaped curve, it has a big bump in the center there, because most of them have a kind of gray phenotype. Now let's say we take those mice and we put them in an environment where there's a lot of dark ground cover. Say they're on the forest floor where there's a lot of dirt, there's a lot of decaying leaves, there's a lot of dark material. Well, those white mice, they're really going to stand out. That's going to be a lot of contrast against the background. So if an owl is flying around and there are some white mice scurrying around on the forest floor, it's going to spot those white mice before it spots any of the darker colored mice. As a result, those white mice are going to get picked off immediately. So the genes for having white fur are going to start disappearing from the population. We'll have mostly dark colored genes remaining. That will be the breeding population that moves forward next. So every generation will get darker and darker and darker because the environment promotes having a dark phenotype. That's directional selection. We're pushing the entire appearance of the population towards the dark end of the spectrum, towards one particular extreme. Now let's imagine that that forest borders on a nice white sandy beach. Now the white mice are still not very fit to the forest floor, but they might be fit for running around on that sand. Their nice white fur blends in very nice with the light colored sand. So as a result, we have two different environments with two contrasting phenotypes that are successful. The very, very dark mice are going to be successful in the forest. The very, very light mice are going to be successful out on that sandy beach. Meanwhile, the gray-colored mice, well, if they go out on the sandy beach, predators are going to be able to spot them. They're going to stand out really well. If they're on the forest floor, they're going to stand out a lot more than those dark-colored mice do, so they're going to be preferentially eliminated from the population. So they're going to start to disappear. Intermediate phenotypes are being selected against, therefore, and the two extremes, very, very light and very, very dark, are being selected for. This is disruptive selection. We have a balance between the dark-colored mice and the light-colored mice with not a whole lot in the middle. Third possibility, stabilizing selection. So instead of a very dark-colored forest floor and a very light-colored sandy beach, we put all of this population of mice onto a substrate like maybe shale or slate, something with a kind of intermediate gray color, a lot of rocks and things like that. And as a result, the really, really dark-colored mice, the black-furred ones, they're going to stand out, as are the really, really light-colored mice, the white-furred ones. Those extreme ends of the phenotype curve are going to be eliminated. They're going to be pecked off by predators, while it is the intermediate phenotype, that is going to be successful in this case, and that's stabilizing selection. We're stabilizing around the Goldilocks average, the perfect intermediate there in the center. And every generation, yeah, you might get some new mutations which cause the mice to be lighter or darker, but those individuals are going to be eliminated by predators. They're going to be selected against in that situation. So this graph here, I love it because you have a starting population with a wide diversity of traits, and then there are 3 different environments we can put them in, and in each environment, a different set of phenotypes, a different set of characteristics, of traits is going to be advantageous. It's going to lead to a higher fitness, a higher reproductive success. So 3 different kinds of natural selection: directional selection, disruptive selection, stabilizing selection. And this is not purely hypothetical either. We've actually seen this kind of thing happening with real-world populations of mice. These 2 mice are of the same species, but different subspecies, and they're found in slightly different environments that are adjacent to each other. So here you can see that there's an inland population that lives in these kind of dry, grassy areas, this kind of, you can see this kind of orange vegetation, this dried out grassy vegetation here, and their fur allows them to blend in pretty much perfectly with that environment. Meanwhile, another population of these mice lives on the sandy beaches not too far away, and they have this very light-colored phenotype. So their fur makes them very well adapted to blending in that surrounding. This would be a perfect example of disruptive selection. We have 2 contrasting phenotypes. Any mouse that's somewhere in between is not going to be successful in either of these 2 locations. Let's check your understanding using a practical example: human birth weight. So birth weight in humans is actually at least partly genetically controlled. If you were a very, very large baby, then your kids have a statistically higher chance of being very, very large babies as well. And the birth weight of a baby is somewhat related to its infant mortality rate, its odds of surviving. If you have a very, very small baby, they have a lower chance of survival. They need to be kind of put into the incubator system. They're going to get chilly really easily. They're kind of vulnerable in a lot of ways. They're less likely to survive. But if you have a very high weight baby, it might need to be born through cesarean section. It might be too large to fit through the birth canal. Now, up until about 50 years ago, that was basically a death sentence for either the mother, the child, or potentially both. So that created a situation where there was high infant mortality if you had a very, very large baby, or if you had a very, very small baby. If we ignore factors like increased development of medical technology, if this process were to continue generation by generation, low weight babies being dangerous, high weight babies being dangerous, but middle weight babies being optimal, what kind of natural selection would you expect to see? A, directional selection, B, disruptive selection, or C, stabilizing selection? Think about it, make your decision, and I'll be back with the answer. The answer is stabilizing selection. It will be stabilizing selection because the extreme phenotypes are being selected against. Small weight babies and large weight babies. That is not an advantageous trait to have, but the intermediate is being selected for. So it will be stabilizing selection. If any kinds of variation occur which cause the population to have higher birth weights, it's going to be selected against, so we'll return back to that average. If they start shifting towards the lower end of the spectrum, it's going to be selected against, and that will return us back to that average. So that's stabilizing selection. Interestingly, now that cesarean sections can be accomplished much, much more safely, and that most of the time the mother and child both survive, average birth weights have been ticking up. So you can see a little bit of directional selection starting to work its way in, basically as a response to medical technology.